And so I want to formally welcome all of you to this session on the basics of Muscadine winemaking. This is part of our Muscadine wine growers and winemakers quality enhancement program. This is one of a number of sessions that we're holding. We've had one earlier on testing and sampling. We had one scheduled on harvesting that we had to postpone and have not yet set a date for it. We'll also be scheduling a couple of winery visits. I know that Nadia, our speaker here today, is hosting one of them. Philip Norden of Treehouse Vineyards has offered to host another, and we may add another one. And those will be later on, probably end of August, September, and in October. So all of you who are signed up for this will get notice of these upcoming sessions. There's several others we are thinking about as well, and those upcoming winery visits. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this is a grant-funded program from the North Carolina Wine and Grape Council, and it allows us to offer some special benefits to North Carolina winemakers and wineries, and that includes a free spectrometer analysis of juice from your grapes for a certain number of samples. And it also allows us to send you a Brix refractometer, handheld refractometer at no charge. There are things we think that y'all can use to improve your when you decide to harvest and better understand what's going on with the grapes. And analysis will be collected. We're trying to collect it as widely as we can on this across the state, particularly on the Muscadine wine grapes, to get a clear picture of what the chemical sort of makeup is of the muscadine juice as it's going into wine, and as the grapes ripen. And then we'll also be able to do some testing of people's wines in process as they go through the winemaking process. Haven't quite figured out how we're going to do that yet, but so if you're interested in that, we do have a sign-up form. It's on the resources page for this M-QEP program, and I'll share a link as well in the chat. And we've already started sending out some of the Brix refractometers, and we'll probably, for those who've already signed up, we'll send the rest out this week, courtesy of Amazon Prime free shipping. So they come in as packages from Amazon. The process for the sampling, for those who did not participate in the last webinar, just so you know what you might be signing up for, all of those details are on the website and were talked about in that first webinar. But we will be asking people to follow a specific sampling method. It's not real complicated. Crush the grapes and then package a small amount of juice up to about a quart of a cup into a unleaking plastic container and send it to the Chuck Johnson's winery, which has got the equipment, is doing the testing. If you're close by, it's in the sort of Yadkin part of the state. If you're close by, you can run it over there, but otherwise you'll need to ship it by UPS. Regular UPS is fine, and you'll want to chill it down and potentially freeze that sample and pack it in some kind of bubble wrap or some kind of insulation, maybe put a cold pack in with it to try to keep it fresh. So we've got all that there. We're paying for the cost of the sample of the testing. You will need to pay for the shipping. And you may want to test more than once during the, maybe 3 weeks before harvest, 2 weeks before harvest, or 2 weeks before, 1 week before harvest, and you will get results back within a day or so. So it can be really useful in deciding when to harvest and get a clear picture of the grapes. So you can contact me if you have questions on it. And again, that information is on the website. So then moving on to today's session on the basics of Muscadine winemaking, one of our speakers, David Bowman was not able to make it. He developed a kind of a last minute conflict. And so Nadia has stepped up to manage the whole session. We know she's entirely competent to do this and is one of our best winemakers in the state. I'm grateful to her for doing this. Nadia may take questions during the course of this, or may just want to wait till the very end and take your questions then. And I'm just going to drift off into the background and turn this over to Nadia. So Nadia, can you figure out how to share your screen? Go for it.
All right, thanks, Debbie. All right, let's see here. Let's see, I am having a little bit of trouble, geez. There we go. It always takes me a few seconds. All right, let's see. Okay.
There we go.
Right. Okay. Okay. So we're actually going to break this into two parts. We had three initially. So I'm going to be discussing about harvesting the grapes, getting them to the crush pad, and processing them on the crush pad. And the second portion would have been about equipment in the winery. So I just kind of put equipment in there as we go along, like what you're going to be using, what you're going to be needing, and we're going to break that into two parts. Then the second part of the presentation later on will be about what you do once you have juice, once you've pressed, what you do with the juice all the way over to the bottle and everything in between. And this is a very short time to try to press all this information together, so please bear with me. As we go along, you're absolutely welcome to stop and ask questions, or you can throw some in the chat if that makes you feel more comfortable, but I'm really happy just to break off where we are and answer your questions, or it's up to you if you want to wait till the end. We'll have a time period between each session to ask questions, and we can go from there. So we'll start off today with talking about receiving and handling grapes on the crush pad. So my name is Nadia Hetzel, and I'm the winemaker at Cypress Bend Vineyards, and we are a Muscadine wine producing facility. I would say we're relatively small, but we are a commercial sized winery. Okay, so we already spoke about our harvest parameters in our last presentation, but I kind of wanted to touch on that again so you have it refreshed in your mind. So I've just got the chemical harvest parameters here that we're looking for. So if you remember, we're going to be measuring bricks for our sugar, and that should somewhere with Muscadine fall in the 14 degree bricks range. pH should be below 3.4, and with Muscadine it's usually much lower than that, but you don't want to go much above 3.4 as it becomes a little bit difficult then with your SO2 levels. And you want your TA in a range of 5.5 to 8.2. So those are optimal chemical harvest parameters for Muscadine and equally for vinifera wine. However, this is where they would normally fall. The bricks in vinifera would of course be much higher. So you also though want to take into consideration beyond just your chemical harvest parameters, you want to get your chemical analysis, but you also want to look at the developing berry, the maturation of the berries. So you want to be looking at things like how are the flavors developing, and how are the physical traits of the berry developing, like how is the skin color turning. For example, Carlos, you go from a light green color and then it starts to develop into a gold color, and then it moves on to like a deep bronze color, and that's usually when our bricks are the highest. Then you want to test for pulp texture and seed color. Usually your seeds will go from like a green to a nice deep brown color. So those things in tandem with your chemical numbers determine when you're going to harvest. So for us, usually harvest is around middle to the end of September, but we're like, I would say in the middle of the southeastern part of the state. So just letting you know that's our time. That doesn't mean it's going to be your time. We generally machine harvest. So here's some of the benefits of machine harvesting is that when you're on a commercial scale, it's much easier. We have 35 acres and it's going to be much easier to send a machine harvester out there than try to send a bunch of people out there who are not going to be able to harvest that quickly. And they probably get lost in all the growth in the canopy out there. So we would definitely always opt for machine harvesting. One of the benefits is that the green berries are automatically separated. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about the uneven ripening that we usually have with Muscadine, that we'll have, for instance, say a cluster that may have really, really hard green berries in it, and then a few optimally ripe berries, and then some that are not quite so ripe. So we have this very uneven ripening pattern with Muscadine. These hard green berries usually at this point are automatically separated because you can set your picker to pick at a certain rate that it leaves the green berries on the vine. And also they just tend to stay on the cluster much easier than the berries that are ready physically ripe. They tend to naturally fall off the vine very easily. So it's also a fast way of harvesting those grapes and getting them out of the heat that we have here in the South. It's just very important because that heat starts to allow microbial spoilage to get a head start. And it's also much less expensive again compared to having people out there hand harvesting and hand sorting, and people usually don't do a very good job of hand sorting. You usually find yourself with a lot of like MOG, which is material other than grapes, and what we refer to as kind of, you know, trash that winds up in your bins when you're harvesting. All right, so this is the machine harvester in action here last year. Unfortunately, we didn't get a front photo, but there he is flying down the vines. And we start off early in the morning to avoid the growth of the excessive heat. And we're lucky that we have all our vines right around us. So the picker is basically filling up the bins as he goes along. And those bins are coming once we got 5 full bins on the tractor trailer, they come immediately to the crush pad and we start processing them right away. So one good thing about a machine harvester too is that you can set the speed and the amplitude of the picker to suit how it is picking. So leaving the green berries on, just picking the optimal ones. And another cool thing is we work with the same harvester every year. And so we've developed a really great relationship. So we're able to really talk to them about that and they understand our needs. But we always walk through at the beginning of harvest to make sure we don't have a lot of berries dropping off the front as the machine harvester goes through, and also to make sure that what we're getting is looking really good in the bins. So if the speed setting on the picker is too harsh or too fast, again, you get those green berries being harvested. However, on the other hand, if it's too vigorous as well, the berries that are ripe may start falling off in front of the picker and you're losing those. We refer to that as shattering. That often happens when grapes are overripe. So that can be an issue and can lead to some loss there. Okay, let's see. And as we're growing along again with the picker, we're loading their grape bins immediately. So the grapes are traveling up a chute and falling into the bins as he's driving along, and the tractor trailer's keeping up with him. So again, in our hot climate, maintaining that fruit quality is a big issue. And there are different options you can do to kind of get a jump on fermentation or spoilage while the grapes are waiting for the press. After a while, I mean, the picker's going much faster than we can at the press. The press is always kind of the bottleneck on the crush pad because we can only put in about 10 tons of grapes at a time before the press is overloaded. And then you have to wait an hour and a half until the press has finished. So therefore, if you get bins piling up on your crush pad, you need to have a backup plan to take care of that. And if you have a cold storage where you are, that's great. We do not, but we will rent a reefer truck and take the berries and put them in a reefer truck that's set at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It may sound like freezing, but they're not going to be in there that long. And it gives them a chance to kind of cool down and avoid some of the wild yeast fermentation while waiting on the press. Another thing that we can do, and that we often do in years where, you know, we have some tricky fruit out there that may not be the best quality, is we'll sprinkle some KMBS or SO2 powder in the bins while they're loading. So we'll have whoever's loading the bins take little baggies with them of pre-measured SO2 and just sprinkle it over the grapes as the bins are loading. And that can do quite a bit to kind of slow down any kind of wild fermentation. Generally, by the time these things are ready to press, or by the time they've reached the crush pad, the bins, the SO2 is totally blown off. So there's no need to worry about that affecting your fermentation later on. And we're going to talk also about what points you should add SO2 on the crush pad here. Another thing to consider are weigh tags. So this is a pretty important thing. I think I enjoy working with it very much. I have worked in a winery or two where they did not use weigh tags, and it makes it very difficult to determine your tonnage or determine the final harvest that you actually have. You're just kind of basing it on the juice you have as opposed to the tonnage. So it's very important to weigh your bins if you can, or weigh your fruit, just to make sure you know how much you have. So we have a large scale here that we basically can drop a whole bin, macro bin on, and receive the weight of the fruit there. So each bin then will get a weigh tag. We'll look at those in a second. And the weigh tag will follow that bin to the crusher to stimmer. Once it's being dumped in there, I take that weigh tag and I take that information and say this bin went into this press, and it was this much tonnage and this much, you know, if there was anything I might note in there, like maybe the fruit came from this area of the vineyard. And so I keep a log of that, and that really helps later on to pinpoint any kind of issues going on in the vineyard, or also pinpoint, you know, exactly which bin came from where, if there were certain disease issues, and you can kind of trace that back. So it's really important for your compliance as well. And then also when you're doing your TTB reports, you have to have that number, period, to let them know, you know, this is how much ton of grapes we harvested, and this is how much juice later on that we yielded. And then you know your juice yield immediately too, that say out of 1 ton, you're getting 122 gallons. You'll be able to work that out very easily. So it's very, very useful to follow have weigh tags in your bins. Also, if you're going to ferment bins or ferment reds in the bin, this really helps you get a concise calculation of the additives you'll need to add, such as yeast or enzymes or whatever. It also ensures that the weight limit of your press isn't exceeded, so you know exactly how much you're putting in the press and not overloading it. So this is what a weigh tag looks like. Your information here, you can write down, it's Carlos, whoever did the weighing, how much it weighed. The bin weight itself is usually around 120 pounds, the ones that we use, and the date, of course. And then they'll actually take this information, this weigh tag, whoever weighed it, keep it separate, and this goes into the macro bin again, and that'll follow it to the crusher to stimmer, where I pull it and then take notes off of it. So it's a great, great tool to keep track of all your fruit. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the process in general. We got our bins, they're on the crush pad. What do? So first of all, we weigh our bins with our weigh tag and add our weigh tag to the bin. Then this is the point where we're going to add our enzymes before we start dumping into the crusher to stimmer. This gives the time for the enzymes to kind of get activated, and going through the crusher to stimmer, they're being slightly macerated. So those enzymes can really start to do their work right there. And then they're transferred to the press. And those enzymes usually help break down sort of the pectin that's in the grape and help for pressability, which is really, really important. And you yield much more juice using them as well. All right, then, of course, after we've added our enzymes, we're going to start dumping our bins into the crusher to stimmer. Or other people use conveyors, or they directly pump to the press. So either way, there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat here. And I'll mainly be showing you what we do, but you know, there are other options out there. So in number 4, while you're dumping into your crusher to stimmer or transferring into the press, whichever, you need to find a way to add rice hulls. So while we're dumping into the hopper of our crusher to stimmer, we're actually adding those rice hulls, and we'll talk about those more into detail. And then number 5, you'll fill your press, of course, and then start your cycle. And as it's pressing, you're going to be monitoring your juice during that press cycle for quality and quality control. So that's the process as an overview. And now we're going to kind of break it down a little bit more. So before processing, again, those additions you're going to do are your enzymes. And basically, like any material of enzymes you can get out there, they're going to have great details of how to add them. So you'll find the instructions on the packaging for sure. If not, you can talk to the company. And of course, before you're loading the crusher to simmer, make sure you have all your rice hulls close on hand because you're going to be using them quite prolifically. So you want to be able to get to them real quickly. And here's a really important point. If this is before you're dumping, so we harvested our bins, or however we're going to transfer them to the crush pad. This point, do not add SO2. You want to add your enzymes. And if you add SO2 at the same time you add your enzymes, that will cause the enzymes to be non-functional. It's okay if you added that little bit of SO2 out on the crush pad. That's fine. By the time the press, or by the time the fruit gets to the press, that would have blown off. So do not add any SO2 at this point. We'll talk about when it's safe to add more SO2. Okay. So rice hulls, super important with any kind of slip skin variety. So a lot of hybrids in the US use this, like your Concord or, you know, hybrids up in the north, Niagara, Edelweiss, grapes like that. So when pressing with a bladder press, and we're going to discuss a bladder press as our main source of pressing, if you've ever taken a muscadine berry and you squeeze it, there's slip skin. So the gelatinous inside will pop out with the juice, and you have kind of this rubbery sort of gelatinous structure inside of there. Now, what would happen if you skip the rice hulls? That kind of gelatinous structure would basically stick to the inside of the press, clogging all of the juice pores where the juice runs out. And you would basically just be turning and slushing, but the juice would not be coming out. So you lose a lot of juice if you skip your rice hulls, and you may even have like serious issues with your mechanical issues with your press. It can be a super big heartache if you forget your rice hulls with muscadine. Very important step here. So don't forget those rice hulls, and there's a lot of ways to source your rice hulls. If you're interested in knowing more, I'll be happy to let you know where you can get them. So here we have a picture of our hopper to our crusher to stimmer. We actually have somebody standing on a ladder that is then brushing the rice hulls in as the fruit is being dumped into the hulls. We have a lot of green fruit in this picture, I noticed, but that was last year where we had very, very strange ripening patterns. Like the fruit just wasn't ripening. So we did have to kind of make some concessions and allow there to be more green fruit in the harvest. But normally it looks much more like all of this bronze stuff and not much of the green berries there. So, but again, they get kicked out anyway, these green berries. So yeah, add your rice hulls directly as you're loading, and it'll therefore mix very well with the berries before going into the press. So here's an overview of our crusher to stimmer on the crush pad. Again, here's our lovely assistant blowing the, or basically scooping the rice hulls from a bucket into the hopper as the grapes are being dumped. So we have a rotator armless forklift. We pick up the boxes. Before that, I'm pulling the weigh tag and I'm adding the enzymes, and then we're dumping it into this bin here and adding the rice hulls, and they're going to get all nice and mixed up in here. Now the green berries weigh less than the very ripe fruit, as well as do the skins. So if the skins have become detached, what's going to happen is through this process, the skins and green berries are going to be kicked out the back here, and they'll collect back here. So that's another way that you're removing those green berries. And then another thing too is they really don't press very well in the bladder press anyway. So they're not going to be that detrimental to your quality. It's just best to have them kind of removed if possible, because they will press to a small extent. And if you had a large quantity of them, they would affect your quality. So after the grapes have gone through our crusher to stimmer here, they fall into this area. And in this box here, there are 2 large rubber rollers that are rolling against each other, and the berries are falling in between them, and they're getting slightly macerated. And at this point, you want to make sure that you don't have your rubber rollers too close together, because you don't want to really, really like absolutely decimate the berries there. You just want them gently squeezed. And then the berries and juice and everything fall into this bin here. And it is then pumped into the back of the press with our musk pump over here. And while we're pumping into the press, we're also rotating the press so that we get an even fill in the press. Okay, and there's multiple ways of getting your must transferred to the press. Again, you can use those conveyor systems or do a direct dump onto your press, or do a direct transfer if you're using a harvesting trailer that has an auger in it. So those are all ways to deliver. However, you want to make sure that you have something with the least amount of mechanical shear, because if you have many spots along the way that are really going to macerate and tear up the berries, that's going to increase your lees and your sediment, and it's going to increase the colloidal particles later on that are going to be very difficult to filter. One of the main differences between vinifera and muscadine is the filterability. And it's really, if you're somebody who's got to process your wines very quickly and get them to market as soon as they've gone through fermentation, and a first racking or whatever, if you've got to like speed things up and get them to the bottle, you're going to really use a lot of filter pads, or have a very difficult time of filtering that early on because of those colloidal particles. They're invisible to the eye, so it may look like your wine is clear, but they actually are very much alive, and they very much block up your filter pads very easily. So the less colloids load, this is where you're getting your colloid load right here, is how you're transferring to the press and how you're treating your berries there, making sure they're not being overly macerated by the time they get there. Also, if you're if you like to like over soak or like let the berries sit a while before you process them so that you get more of the resveratrol or the health benefits, you're going to be battling with colloids, and they're going to tend later on to develop browning, or to cause the wines to develop early oxidation. So that's another reason you want to avoid having too many colloids and too much shear, mechanical shear on your berries early on. So again, that's going to benefit you later in the run with easier settling and filtration. So you want to have your flow points that are, like from your conveyor systems or augers or pumps or whatever, that the flow point is not much less than 3 inches, and avoid those tight auger spaces where they're just being torn up with the auger as they're being processed and flowed. Yeah. Okay. So now we're transferring to the press. This is kind of a bigger overview here. You can see the bins being loaded, and there's somebody back here with the rice hulls handing them up to our rice hull person. And then again, the fruit is flowing into the back of the press this way, and the press is rotating constantly. Okay, while we fill. So this is what we use to transfer the press. This just happens to be the piece of equipment that we have. It's a musk pump that we purchased through Criveller, so it's probably from Innovinita, or an Italian pump, musk pump, and it has a 3-inch wide opening and a piston action on it, so it's moving that fruit through without any kind of brutal destruction to the grapes. Okay, so now we're talking about pressing the juice. And this is an important step as well. We've got our press full of grapes now that we've transferred it over. We're going to talk about the additives that we add at this point to the juice. We're going to talk about how long to press, and that's also has a lot to do with the winemaker tasting the juice and tasting developments going on. And then definitely a big one is your fruit quality. If you're having issues with your fruit quality, that's going to determine your pressure and time that you're going to use on your press in order to, yield the least amount of pressing time, but yield the most amount of juice, because you just don't want too much contact with that rotten fruit if you have rotten fruit. And then the fruit quantity, again, those weight tags are essential here, is to avoid under or overloading your press. which, yeah, leads to much heartache if you over or underload it. We'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so here we are pressing our juice. Our press is activated and it's rotating, and that juice is flowing out of these little openings here, these little channels, and that's what we were talking about earlier. If you were to skip the rice hulls, these would just completely block up with the gelatinous structure of the muscadine berry, and this juice would not be flowing. You'd hear it slosh around a lot in the press, but it wouldn't flow, and your press is just going to chug along and get really mad at you. So this is a great overview of our press pan and our juice that we're yielding. At this point, I'm always taking samples to measure our bricks. I'll take a sample to measure the acidity and the pH as well at this point. Let's see, and for additives, if you have relatively healthy fruit, you can get away with adding 25 ppm of SO2 to your juice bin. So this is the point where you can add SO2 again once you're here at the juice stage, because the enzymes have done what they've been, basically set up to do. So you can add your SO2 to maintain quality here at this point. If you have very high rot or high disease, you may want to up that a little bit. A lot of that SO2 will deplete on its way, especially if there's a high rot load. A lot of those microbiological spoilage potential there will be hemmed in and will actually drop those numbers on the SO2. Also at this point, if you have very high rot, you may want to consider adding some activated carbon or activated charcoal to kind of remove those flavors or aromatics. And really with muscadine, I haven't encountered this at all yet. But when I was working with vinifera like Rieslings and so forth, this happened very often with grapes that they let hang to like a raisin stage or would harvest much later. You would undoubtedly have like botrytis rot in the fruit, no matter how hard you tried. So that's where we would up our SO2 and drop in some activated charcoal. And again, taste is the most important thing. So how long do we want to press? We're going to take samples of the juice at the beginning of each pressure step. And we're going to look inside of a press in a moment, and I'll tell you what a pressure step is. But at the beginning of each pressure step, so each one is about 20 minutes, maybe a pressure step, sometimes 5 or 10 minutes. As the pressure increases, it changes. So as you go along and the pressure starts to increase and is at, kind of a midway point or almost near the end of pressing, you're going to see a lot of less juice yield, but you need to be tasting because you're going to start picking up more bitterness. Your pH is going to increase, and the bricks are definitely dropping. So if that's a concern, you can either realize that this will be, put in a blend anyway, so you may want to just go ahead and allow those little more drops of juice to come along, or you may just decide, hey, nope, we're going to break it right here, considering our quality, and we're going to go ahead and dump the press and reload it. With high rot, you may want to consider breaking it a little bit early, like after the second or third pressure step, just to avoid a lot of the off aromas that you're going to be yielding. Another thing to discuss with pressing your juice is that you also, if you want to increase your quality and have like a really high end quality of juice to produce maybe one of your top wines, consider a no press option. In other words, doing a free run where you allow the juice while it's loading to just kind of settle off, and whatever juice you yield there, you keep in one tank, and then you separate your tanks, go to another, and start your press then and collect that juice separately. So you can break your juice into different press fractions in order to separate quality and blend them back together later. But for your high-end wines, you may want to just stick with the free run juice. All right. Okay, so fruit quality is, of course, again, another issue when it comes to how long you're going to press. So high quality fruit can actually go through the entire press cycle. You'll notice towards the end that you're not yielding very much juice at all. But if that's not an issue with your production, just go ahead and take it into the whole batch, or separate it into a different press fraction. Another issue is high MOG, and that usually occurs more with people hand harvesting. You'll have like a lot of leaf trash, a lot of twigs, a lot of gosh knows what falling into your bin out of the canopy. And if you don't have a crusher to stimmer and you're going directly to the press or a way to separate all that trash, the material other than grapes, then you may want to stop pressing at a certain point as well, because you will actually yield some green aromatics and green flavors from like high leaf, high levels of leaves in your press. All right. Okay, and fruit quantity, you need to know the max weight limit of your press, obviously, and the best way to make sure you're not overloading is to use those weight tags and calculate how much wet weight is actually going into the press. And then also you'll know if you're under a certain amount of weight where the press just isn't going to function properly and is not going to produce enough pressure to press the berries that you've added. So you'll have a lot of loss there if you have a very minimal weight. You'll basically struggle to get a lot of juice from that. Okay, so this is what a press looks like, and it's not what our press looks like, but it's the general concept of a bladder press. So over here in the front portion, we have a press being loaded with the berries. That's what we're taking this red stuff as. And again, it has those slits just like we showed in the other picture, and the juice is going to flow out there and be collected. In the center portion, and our press is built up differently, it's on the side portion. In the center portion, there is a bladder, and this bladder is made out of, gosh, now I can't think of the term right now, but, but a specific material. So it will pneumatically inflate with air when we're in our pressure cycle. And that inflation will then press against the berries. And it's a very gentle way of pressing berries, actually. You're not seeing a lot of shear going on here. So as opposed to, the types of presses that we saw in the olden days where you ratcheted it down. I mean, that's fine too, but it's much more gentle on the berries. You're not going to have any breakage of seeds and so forth. So it's a wonderful way to yield your juice in a very gentle extraction. So what happens is we've filled our press with the juice. Then we're going to set off our press, and it's going to stop. It's going to inflate to maybe, 0.5 bars, and it's going to hold that for maybe a minute or two. Then it's going to break back down, and it's going to cycle again. It's going to turn, the press is going to turn to break up the berries that are there, and then it's going to stop, and it'll cycle up to half a bar again and press, and it'll break down, and it'll rotate again, and then it'll inflate up again to half a bar. Now, as we're in that half a bar pressure timing, that is considered one press cycle. Then we go to the next press cycle, and as it rotates, stops, it's going to inflate to even more, maybe 0.8 bar or 1 bar of pressure. So that's the difference between the pressure step cycles, is the amount of pressure that the press is going to be putting on the grapes each time it goes through an inflation process there. So one pressure step may last 20 minutes or so, or 15 minutes, because it's just doing the same thing over and over at the same pressure level again. So that lets you know too, like maybe, I'm in pressure step 1. I don't want to go to 1.5 bars. I want to stop it there. So you can read the press as it's going along in its cycles and just stop it once it starts to break down in between the next pressure step before it gets to a higher press. So there we go. The reason why I'm showing you a lot of these pictures of different types of equipment too is that was supposed to be part of a separate presentation, but I'm just going to kind of like pop these into the presentation as we go along. So there's different ways to transfer your juice to your tanks. And what you want to bear in mind there is that when you're transferring juice, undoubtedly you're still going to have seeds, you're still going to have a berry here or there, you're going to have rice hulls in there. So you need a press that can deal with a lot of solids coming through it. And some of those presses, some of those pumps that will transfer your juice into your tanks to be considered are a peristaltic pump, which is very, very gentle. It's considered one of the most gentle forms of transfer in the wine industry. And then over here, we have a mono pump. So we have this area here. This is our rotor, this part in the middle, and this is our stator in the middle. And as the rotor is moving along, it's forwarding the wine out as kind of like a positive displacement pump. And then here's some other, this is a centrifugal pump. This is not like an impeller here that you would find in a, an impeller pump. We'll talk about those later. But this is just like a piece of metal, and this suction's causing a vortex and flowing the wine out. Also a gentle way of moving without the juice, like destroying the filter or giving it issues, having issues. And then this is a diaphragm pump, which is most commonly used to transfer your like solids, like when you're transferring the juice with the berries and everything into the press. That's also a good option here, this diaphragm pump. Okay, what you don't want to use, and that's what we're really leading up to for this purpose, is a flexible impeller pump, because it doesn't handle seeds very well. It doesn't handle lees very well, or any kind of debris in the juice, or carbonation after fermentation. You get a lot of cavitation, or you get, you know, this impeller just starts to deteriorate on you. It can cause a lot of issues. So you want to avoid using your flexible impeller pump until you're at a pretty clear stage of your young wine where there's not a lot of debris in there. And definitely don't use it for lees. If it sticks and it jams up or anything, the pump can burn out. These parts can actually burn out and then ruin your wine. So it's very rare. I've seen it happen like once, and I've been in the industry since '97, but I have seen it happen. Okay, so we're at the end of the point where we've got juice and we're in the tanks. And so now it's time to move on to fermentation. But I'd like to field your questions if you have any questions at this point. Did we get any questions in the chat? Okay, so somebody's interested in finding out more for home winemakers and these steps. Yeah, we might be able to get some information out to you, break this down into kind of a smaller setting for home winemakers. For now, this is just kind of like on a commercial level of an overview. But yeah, if you'd like that kind of information, we can get that to you as well and forward it to you. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Nadia, I just asked a question. You know, basically, if you were going out and you needed a must pump today, what would you purchase? Okay,
sure. Well, also, it depends on your own setting and how much you're processing and so forth. However, I suppose I would purchase something that has like a piston action, something that's going to be very strong and powerful and move the grapes onward. There's a lot of people out there you can get up with. There's Creveller's a company that has a lot of different options, as well as, darn, I can't think of them right now. My mind just went blank. But
well, I purchased some things from GW Kent.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a great one as well. Absolutely. And they also have stuff for like smaller, if you have like a smaller amount to transfer, they probably have smaller options there as well, which is really good. I like the pump that we are using, which is kind of a piston pump / mono pump, which really moves the fruit through very quickly. So there's no time for it to settle and get issues with shear or block up. So it's been a very, very good pump. All right. Oh, and I see here someone asks how much rice hulls. That's a good question. So as we're loading, I would say one bin holds about, you know, about 1,000, maybe 1,300 pounds. And for about 1,000 pounds, we would use about one 5-gallon bucket. We'd use 3 to 5 1-gallon or 5-gallon buckets, so maybe 15 gallons of rice hulls there. And it also depends on how juicy the fruit is coming in. If we have a very juicy fruit, Magnolia tends to be very juicy when we're processing it. We'll add more rice hulls just to kind of make sure everything is going to work out very well. But really, you can add quite a lot, and it's not going to affect the flavor or anything of the wine because it's very inert, those rice hull systems. So, yeah. Does anybody have any more questions at this point?
I do. To jump
Yes,
in.
sir.
What and I probably missed this. What is the purpose of the rice hulls?
Okay, yes, sir. So the rice hulls actually, they mix up with the berries as a whole. And then later on, when you go to the press, it helps the press to kind of yield the juice out of it as much as possible. And then if you were to skip it and you just went ahead to the press without the rice hulls, it's not going to yield all the juice out, but also it's going to stick to the sides of the press and cause your pressability to be very, very difficult. So it'll actually hamper the pressing process. So it makes it much easier to press, and you're going to yield more juice if you add those rice hulls in there. Because just the structure of the berry, how it's so gelatinous and so forth, it has a lot of the juice in that structure. So the rice hulls also help it to kind of release some of that juice or access some of the juice more easily.
Where can we buy those?
Oh, yes, sir. So there's probably brewing supply if you want it on a smaller scale, because brewers use it as well, beer brewers. But we get our record from the source, and I can share that with you. It's in Arkansas, I believe, a rice company. I think it's actually called Rice Land USA. And that's where they produce the rice. So they have like bulk amounts of rice hulls. So we'll order a whole pallet of it. Each bag is like 50 pounds, and you just break them into a macro bin, and you can just scoop them out with a bucket there and use them from there. So yeah, I think it's called Rice Land, and you can get up with them and they'll ship it to you. And it's very inexpensive, the rice hulls themselves. It's the shipping that's super expensive, sadly. But if you need any contact information, I'd be happy to get that to you too as well.
Very well, thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, how many gallons of juice does a ton of muscadine yield? That's a really good question. Okay, so that varies from year to year, depending on a lot of different issues going on in your vineyard. So for instance, last year we had grapes that weren't fully ripened. They didn't really maintain a lot of juice. And then also we had a year before that where we probably should have used our irrigation. However, it seemed to rain so much we thought we didn't need it, but we had a lot of dry berries. So there we had, those yields were off. But they vary for us anywhere between 110 to about 140 gallons of juice per ton of muscadine. So, and that also is going to vary per what type of muscadine you're yielding. But your weigh tags, again, another great way to determine your juice yield later on to a much more specific, finer point. Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of weigh tags. We'll just put it that way. Okay, and here's a question. So the seeds in the grape are crushed and not removed. That's a really good question. So the seeds are actually not removed during the crushing to stemmer process. The berries are crushed so the juice starts to yield, but the seeds themselves are not going to impart any issues or flavors later on when we get all of the juice and seeds and skins pushed into the press. So they actually maintain throughout the entire process of pressing. And later when we break down the press and we open it and we look inside and we see the leftovers from what was in the press, that were our pumice is what we call that. We can pull a handful out and it'll actually look like, it's really terrible to say this, but it kind of looks like horse apples, because the rice hulls and it's all clumped together into a ball sort of shape and a funny shape. And the seeds are just a large part of that material at that point, but they are not damaged. They're still very whole. So no, we do not remove the seeds during that time. Or if we're even going to do reds like Noble, we leave the seeds and the skin on throughout fermentation so that we yield more color from the skins where all that color is. So yeah, that's a really good question. Okay.
So Nadia, why don't you move on to the next part? Those are really good questions. I think if you have more questions that come to mind on this first part during the next part, just type them in there and we'll come back to them at the end.
Exactly. So, okay. Okay, so let's see. So I'm going to try and get into our next. All right, 1 moment. Okay, 1 moment. So, sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Is it still sharing the screen?
Yeah.
It is? It's sharing the screen? Okay. So I'm going to.
It's bigger now. I can see more of it.
Okay, great.
What is-
All right. Oops. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Takes a little time to get around it. Can everyone see the presentation? Is it good?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Good.
Okay, so now we're going to do making great muscadine wine from fermentation to bottle. And again, we are talking more commercial scale here, but we can scale it down and get you that information later. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my background. I have an engineering degree from Germany in winemaking and enology from the University of Geisenheim, which is a cold climate winemaking region. And it works primarily with Rieslings and so forth. So I've done a lot with that. And I also did a 3-year apprenticeship as a vintner in Germany. And then I came to the States. I worked in Texas for a while with hot climate hybrids, which was really fascinating. We worked with a grape very heavily called Blanc du Bois. And then I moved to Iowa, where I worked with cold climate American hybrids, such as Concord, Edelweiss, Brianna, La Crescent, those types of varieties, which were cold climate hybrids again. And now I've come down to North Carolina, which is actually where my family is from here in the US. And I've been working with Muscadine, which has been a very fascinating ride. So there's a lot to be said for this grape. It is the indigenous grape of the southeastern United States. It's very important to our heritage locally here, period. And I just felt like it deserved much more recognition and respect than it often gets. And so therefore, I've just become very fascinated and enamored by it. And I've enjoyed working with the muscadine industry very much. Okay, so that being said, we'll move on. Okay, so these are the fermentation steps we're going to discuss. First of all, we're going to talk about racking our juice once we've received it from the press. We're going to let it settle out a little bit, and we're going to rack it off of the gross solids that settle at the bottom. And we'll talk about all these steps into more detail. Then we're going to talk about chaptalization. In other words, adding sugar to increase our Brix for fermentation so that we have a better alcohol yield, and it also improves the flavor balance later on. Then we're going to talk about yeast selections, which can become very esoteric depending upon your beliefs in yeast and what it can do and so forth. And then we're going to talk about the yeast nutrients and why that's very important to keep your yeast happy during fermentation. Then we'll talk about yeast rehydration in those steps. And then we're going to talk about monitoring the fermentation. Okay, so get into this. So fermentation and racking, it's up to you. Some people decide not to rack, but preferably you do rack, as it will have a small effect, at least on your quality later on. So to remove those gross solids is pretty important because they will have a flavor impact on your wine. So there are different ways, and these are extremely large scale, I realize this. These are ways to avoid juice loss if you decide to rack and you just do not want to lose any juice whatsoever. You'd probably lose about anywhere from 20 to 80 gallons of juice doing this because the settling is very, very vague in the juice stage. So it doesn't settle very, very tightly or anything or compactly within a day or two, and you've got to get to fermentation pretty quickly. So if you decide that you want to save some of the wine, your options is like a large producer. This is called a rotary vacuum filter. And again, I want to add these bits of equipment in there just so you're exposed to them and are aware of them as well, because these larger wineries big wineries are using these. So what's happening here is inside here, a vacuum's being pulled as this drum rotates. The drum has DE on it that has swum on it. Down here is the wine. And as the drum rotates down there, it's going to pick up the wine and any kind of debris in the juice and filter it lightly through here. And then this knife basically cuts off the layer of debris that's collected on the outside of the drum. So it's a pretty straightforward process, and it's very great if you got a big winery. But most like wineries, small to mid-size, would maybe opt for this option, which is a yeast press filter. So you actually swim these on with DE as well. And there's a piston pump in here, a pressure pump that is going to force the juice across the filter pads, and it'll remove the solids then. So that's like if you just want to absolutely separate your solids. There's some other options too, like a centrifugal system, but they're not that optimal. So if you decide not to rack, then you should probably start your fermentation within 8 hours of pressing the juice, because you've got a lot of microbial load in there as well. So you want to use a quick acting yeast and start your fermentation very quickly. So again, there is a small flavor loss of quality when you don't rack, so bear that in mind. And some, if you're a winery of size that you can, just suck up the loss, then that's probably what you want to do. So this to me is the key equipment period to your fermentation and through processing wine altogether. And of course, as a smaller producer, you're probably going to say like, what? I don't have something like that, but you can develop some kind of a cooling system when fermenting your wines. If you're either keeping it in a cool area or running cold water over, if you're doing it in a small glass can or small glass bottle that you can basically keep it in cold water or with ice water during the fermentation, or in a refrigerator situation. But we use a glycol chiller. And what you see here, this dimpling on the outside jacket of our tank, you can flow this through with glycol. And there is a temperature well on the back, sensing the temperature, and in the front here. And this one in the back will trigger this unit here, which is a digital way to control, or digital control of the temperature. So I can set the temperature down to whatever I need it to be, and it'll start the flow of the glycol. And we have a compressor unit and the glycol unit outdoors. But to me, it's incredibly essential to keep our fermentation at a certain temperature. We also keep the inside of our winery at a certain temperature at all times, because you will have heat differences between top and bottom portion of your tank. Up here, it's much hotter where the heat rises. And so having a good AC system that really mixes through the air and really keeps your temperatures is highly important. And everybody kind of, differs on what temperature they're going to keep it at. We do set our fermentation temperature though around the 60-degree Fahrenheit point, and that's another debatable point for each person to decide what they want. Very important though to keep your fermentation cool, because if you do not, you tend to lose a lot of aromatics. Your wines build medium chain fatty acids, I believe, and those are irremovable at the end, and they basically block the yeast's ability to yield esters and aromatics in that way, because they'll just cling on to those fatty acids and be lost. I know I'm not doing the best job of explaining that, but there is a reason to keeping your wines chilled through fermentation. Okay. And then you have to maintain that temperature. Okay, so now we're going to talk about chaptalization, or about our sugar levels. So we've talked about Brix before, and that is the commonly used measurement in winemaking. So you'll want to get yourself a hydrometer, and like a cylinder beaker like this, where you can get your juice in there and drop your hydrometer in. And then you would eye it to see where you're along the meniscus, where your Brix land. So if I took a tank sample of the juice that I've just gotten in and I read 14.2 Brix, the interesting thing is that 1.8 Brix equals 18 grams per liter of sugar. And 1.8 Brix will lead us to 1% potential alcohol, which kind of breaks down those numbers to give us an easier overview of how we get to our potential alcohol later on and how much sugar we need. So wine should have an ABV of at least 10% to have a great mouthfeel, to be a full product. Especially with white wines, they should have at least 10% ABV. Reds, much higher, usually about 13% ABV. So let's see, I need to look at my math here again. So 18 grams per liter times 10% ABV is what we're aiming for, would equal 180 grams per liter of sugar that we need to add. So how many liters do you need to sugar? Say you've got 275 gallons or something. You would take that number and multiply it by 3.785. That'll get you your liters. And then you can go from liter roughly to gram per liter and get your alcohol percentage. So I'm gonna help you out there though. Don't worry about doing math. So if you're like me and you run in and there's math involved, you can also just go to this website. And I'm serious, you want to take this number down. Even if you're a small producer, this is very, very helpful for every step of winemaking. It's a website called wineads.com. So you would, for adjusting your Brix, you would go to ferment in the blue bar and click on Brix adjust and change the agent to sugar. And you just pop in your volume, like 275 gallons, and boom, you've got how much sugar you need to add in order to get to the Brix level that you want later on. And that'll tell you how much alcohol then you're going to be producing. So it's a very, very easy to use product. Don't worry about all the math we're doing. It's all there. So chaptalization. So depending on the size of your winery, you can either mix a portion of the wine with sugar, use it using like maybe a modified paint mixing tool, or you can invest in like a sugar mixing tank. And there are some options out there on the market. And then when returning the sugar to the main tank, you might want to consider agitating the tank as you're adding the sugar in. So we have one of these guys, it's a Guth mixer, and that helps us to kind of mix in any kind of additives we need in the wine and get a good overall mixing of the tank. So that's really very, very helpful for sugaring, is to have some kind of setup where you can dissolve the sugar first before adding it back to your main batch. And for smaller wineries, of course, you can stir it or whatever option you find there to be easiest. So now we're going to get into the yeast selection, which is like splitting hairs. And of course, all yeast is not the same. And it's just about your mentality or your ideology behind your winemaking. But this tends to be the part where you can make a lot of stylistic decisions on how you want your wines to be later on. So a normal healthy dose of yeast is considered to be 35 grams of yeast per liter. That'll help you kind of work out later on how much you need to add. But again, we have wineads.com. So are you more concerned about getting fermentation over the board quickly and without any issues? Then you'll probably want to go with a workhorse yeast, and there are several out there. Or do you want to maintain certain aromatics or target certain aromatics in certain types of wines? Like I tend to think that Carlos has a very sort of tropical fruity nose to it, tropical fruity flavors. I think that Magnolia has kind of grapefruit sort of citrusy notes to it. So my choice of yeast is going to determine later on how much of that will then remain in the wine. Of course, wine does change while it's aging, so it's not going to have those same fruity esters as it initially does after fermentation. So, you know, after using the same yeast over and over, you get a feel for how it is working out. And you can do small trials in your lab too, just take small amounts and add different types of yeast to find out which one works the best for you. So good places to look for yeast. Here in North Carolina, Carolina Wine Supply has a wonderful selection of Lafleur yeasts. And then Scott Labs has a plethora of yeast selections. There's from different companies in different areas of the world where you can kind of look at a chart and say, oh, I wanted to have, you know, peach, or I wanted to have this or that or this or that. These types of yeast will then help you get close to a style of wine that you would like to have. Okay, so what does yeast do? Basically, very simple. It eats sugar and it produces alcohol as a byproduct and carbon dioxide as waste. So each sugar makes alcohol and carbon dioxide. But it's not that easy. It also needs to be fed a proper balanced diet so it can do its job and be living in a solution, which is our wine juice, which is going to be pretty chaotic for yeast to live in anyway, live in a solution that it can survive in. So when you have something like a stuck fermentation, likely what's going on is that later through fermentation, your alcohol is increasing, which is becoming toxic to your yeast cells, and it's killing it, and the carbon dioxide as well acts toxic. So if you're unable to give it some kind of nutrition or some kind of benefits, you're also going to develop sulfides in your wine for sure, and you're going to have other off aromatic components because you have angry yeast and you don't want angry yeast. So yeast nutrients, yeast needs nutrition in the form of nitrogen to survive. That's their food. It's their hamburgers and, well, I mean, not their hamburgers, but it's their salad and their healthy food that keeps them surviving and fermenting successfully. And there are different types of nitrogen forms out there. So we talked before about our juice samples that we'd be sending off to Chuck over at Shadow Springs. One of the things that he'll be able to tell you is how much yan is available in your juice. Yan is the number of yeast assimilable nitrogen, which is telling you already how much nitrogen your grapes have available for fermentation right off the bat. And this came off, you know, through fermentation. It came off through not fermentation. It came off through fertilization, how much fertilizer you used, or, you know, how the grapes processed the nitrogen that was available to them. And you'll have a certain amount of nitrogen available for starting. But once you have that number, you can calculate how much more yan you will need. And yan is, oh, excuse me. So again, it's, you know, directly linked to how your soils are. But you're never going to have enough yan initially to get you through fermentation. It's usually never happens. So let's say your sample is 114 ppm that Chuck gives you the numbers back saying that. And basically ppm is just a fancy way of saying milligrams per liter. So this makes it much more calculable. And in general, to ferment, you need 12.5 ppm or 12.5 milligrams per liter of yan or available nitrogen per 1 brick's depletion. So if we're going to ferment for 1 brick, for every brick that we ferment, we need 12.5 milligrams per liter of yan or nitrogen. So we sugared our wine to 20 bricks, for example. That should give us an ABV around 10 or more, probably 11. So 12.5 ppm times 20 bricks is 250 ppm to ferment, or 250 milligrams per liter of nitrogen to ferment all the way to 0. And 250 ppm minus your number up here that Chuck gave you, 114, means that you still need 136 ppm of yan for your fermentation. So you got to find a way to get that number all together. So now you have to decide which nutrients you're going to use to fulfill that requirement. And we're going to start with a rehydration nutrient, such as GoFirm, which is the most popular one on the market. So Scott Labs is where you want to go. If you want to, you can go Google Scott Labs here, you know, after the presentation, and you'll find all these things: yeast, nutrients, and a wonderful way of calculating how much nutrients and what nutrients you need. So you're going to start with your rehydration nutrients, such as GoFirm. And that's probably going to give you maybe 30 ppm of YAN. Then you're going to make another addition of nutrients at when you see a drop of 2 to 3 Brix in your wine, when you're monitoring the sugar dropping. And at that point, you want to add something like Fermate O at 3.3 pounds for 1,000 gallons. That's the amount of adding. That's going to give you another, say, 40 to 50 ppm of YAN. And then you'll make a final nutrient addition at 1/3 sugar drop. So that'll give you the rest of the YAN that you need to reach this point. And you can calculate how much you need based left over and just add the right amount of nutrient. So you don't want to add too many nutrients, just say like, well, I'm just going to throw this in there and that'll be close by. The reason why you don't want to do that is because later on, opportune microbes are going to be like, yay, I got nutrients to eat, and other yeasts, and they're going to take off with that leftover YAN, and they're going to do things to your wine you didn't know they could do. So you do not want to leave them a bunch of YAN to eat later on. You want them to die off from the excessive alcohol and kind of the excessive factors that are going to cause them to be knocked down. So really important now is monitoring your fermentation once you've kicked it off with the yeast and your GoFirm, or basically your first dose of nutrients. So you want to take samples from each tank daily around the same time. You also want to measure the temperature at the tank when you take that sample to make sure that it's maintaining your fermentation temperature. And again, that's usually around the 60-degree mark. And then make sure your temperatures your samples reach room temperatures. You're going to take those samples with you to the lab and let it reach room temperature before you sample. For that is, cold samples will read higher than room temperature samples. So another thing too is if the samples are ultra foamy from the high CO2 levels, you may want to stir them with just like a wire whip or something, or even shake the sample in a bottle to remove some of the CO2, so that those CO2 levels aren't interfering with your readings. Because sometimes you'll see the hydrometer just kind of like bob from the CO2 levels during fermentation. So you need to find a way to kind of remove some of the CO2 before taking the sample. So this is what a fermentation curve looks like. If you're taking your samples and you're logging your Brix levels every single day, you would later on be able to plot them on a graph and see how your fermentation went. And this is a very, very representative graph. So this is your lag phase. But if you see your lag phase still stretching out like over to here or something before it starts to decline, you may have some issues with your yeast. You may want to repitch it again. But it should within like 3 to 4 days just drop off significantly. So you have your lag phase when the yeast is adapting to the juice conditions. Then you have that rapid fermentation phase where you got plenty of nutrients. The fermentation is just happy as can be. And then you have this transitional phase where the alcohol is building and the CO2 is going to start causing the cells to readapt to their situation. And it's just going to be slower fermentation till it completes from there, because your yeast are like, you know, they're in a lot of alcohol and other things that usually they don't really work very well in. So all those nutrients are super important to keep them fortified and going this way. Okay, so after fermentation, we've reached our 0 Brix point. We've gone into the cellar and made sure that every single tank has reached, you know, the end of fermentation, or the tanks that we're working with. And now we're going to go into our first racking. And then we're going to go on to a second racking, and then we're going to go through cold stabilization. Then we'll start blending our wines. We'll sterile filter, and then we can bottle. So these are the steps leading up to bottling, and we're going to kind of break them down here. So your first racking is probably going to happen about 3 weeks after fermentation. And what you're just going to do is basically be transferring off of a racking valve the fermented wine, young wine, and then you're going to open up the racking valve and be removing the juice off the top. And it's kind of like, you know, when you go to the lake or something and you can look down at the sand and you can see the sand at the bottom, you're going to start to see that as the tank empties out, and you're going to be able to hold the hose over, suck off the finished wine, and you'll see the remainder of the lees inside of the tank. Those you want to dispose of, that point, since it's the first racking, it's called gross lees. And it is gross, but it's also just a lot of lees. So in Europe, they tend to take the gross lees and they dump them back in the vineyards because they do have some benefit as a fertilizer. And again, do not use your flexible impeller to pump your gross lees out of the tank. You might want to go back to using your mono pump or your centrifugal pump or something that can handle that kind of solid waste. So the second racking should occur another 2 to 3 weeks after the first racking. This point, we're going to have fine lees. So we're going to have a lot less lees than we did the first time. And this sediment is referred to as fine lees. And if you wanted to do something, you know, similar to a Chardonnay where you leave it on the lees a little bit and, you know, mix that up in order to kind of get a buttery taste, then you would want to maintain these fine lees during the maturation of the wine. So after second racking, you can perform cold stabilization, and you can consider adding any fining agents you want to at this time. However, wines with a low pH, which our muscadites tend to always have, will have trouble settling out with fining agents. So if you're expecting to add gelatin and silica sol and have that have the solids drop out and form a firm cake at the bottom, it's probably not going to happen for a long time. Don't expect it to happen within a week or so. It can be very, very frustrating. You might consider using hot sparkleoid instead, or adding bentonite with the gelatin silica sol fining just to drop it out a little bit better. What we do is we just let time take its time. We let the first and second racking happen and then let it settle out again before we start cold stabilizing. And that cold stabilization is another form of racking then as well. And the tartrates that form will actually settle over the top and compact any solids on the bottom. So at that point, we're usually seeing a wine that's fairly clear, and it's going to make our filtration process so much easier. We talked about those colloids before. We don't know 100% why Muscadine is so much different, but it is very, very difficult to filter early on. So like letting it settle out on its own has been the best way we have found to deal with that. And you use a lot less filter pads than say doing your first racking and going straight to filter pads and trying to filter it down. You're going to go through so many very expensive filter pads. So just letting it settle out and then going through cold stabilization before you perform your filtration processes will really save you some time and heartache if you can wait that long. Okay. So cold stabilization is the next process, and it is the removal of tartrates or the salt of tartaric acid from the wine. And it happens when the wine becomes chilled, that it will drop, or the solution of these tartrates will become imbalanced, and it will drop out the salts. And the salts tend to stick to the side of the stainless steel surfaces of tanks, which makes it super practical. I just go to my temperature gauge on my glycol chiller on the tank and tell it to go to about freezing, and it does, and it forms this great little ice sheet like around the entire tank where the glycol is. And during that freezing process, those salts are just going to stick to the side of the tank. These are actually noble tartrates from cleaning a noble tank, and they collected at the bottom, of course. It doesn't quite look like this when it's up on the side of the tanks, but there is a lot of tartrates that fall out. Why do this step at all? Well, you know, if you're just going to have some wine for yourself and your friends, you don't even need to worry about this. But if you do have a commercial production facility here in the US, people invariably will think you're trying to kill them when they put a bottle of wine in the fridge and they see these crystals start to fall out on them. and they think that there's something wrong with the wine, and it's just considered a form of having a, you know, a stable or a very clean wine later on, is that these things will not happen. So we have to remove them in a commercial setting by dropping the temperature and keeping it at 32 degrees Fahrenheit at least for 2 weeks. And then around that time, I start taking samples of the tank and freezing those samples of like 200 milliliters of wine. And then I'll pull them out of the freezer, let it go back to room temperature. And if they're still throwing out amounts of tartrates, then we need to keep the chilling process going on in the tank until that stops happening. Okay, so with cold stabilization, you know, rack twice. It needs to be visibly clear of solids before you start to process. So if your wine's still super hazy, which it shouldn't be if you've waited the appropriate amount of time, then you may want to consider going ahead and trying to filter it anyway, because normally it shouldn't have any more very, very thick solids at this point. So again, keep the tank at 32 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 weeks. That can be very hard on your energy bill. So if that's something you cannot or just won't consider, there is an alternative. So you can purchase cream of tartar in large 50-pound bags. And if you add 4 grams per liter, once 32 degrees Fahrenheit has been reached on the tank, and mix for 4 to 6 hours, and you maintain that temperature, and then filter off with KD3 pads the next day where some of the tartrates have settled out, then you can filter off and remove all the tartrates that way, because what happens is you're superseding it with the cream of tartar, and it's going to, those crystals as they form are going to latch onto the cream of tartar and then fall out very quickly. So it's going to cause that process to be sped up very, 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 very quickly. Cream of tartar is somewhat expensive, but probably cheaper than having your glycol chiller running for 2 to 3 weeks successively, because you're going to have to do it for each tank. Okay. Wait a minute. Let's see. Wait a minute. I don't know why I put questions there, but I guess like if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them. We're not quite finished yet. But if you want to go ahead and ask any questions. But again, I'm just pointing out here that it's very, very difficult. We're finding serious problems with filtering Muscadine wines early on, as opposed to with vinifera, where you can find them and they go straight to a filtration. So we just take the luxury of taking the nature of time to settle out. Let's see. I wanted to point out here that there are some interesting things going on now in the industry. Currently, App State University is working with the Muscadine industry and the Winemakers Association. We're trying to find a way that we can send samples up of juice and wine, that we can find out some of these issues that we're starting to see with Muscadine, because there's not like a Muscadine winemaking book out there. There's no real definitive information about how to make Muscadine wine specifically. And we're running into certain issues as winemakers in the cellar. And so we're asking them to do some research on that. And so one of the things they're going to be doing is looking into why it's so difficult to settle out Muscadine wine and how difficult it is to filter and what can maybe be done to change that. Also, they're going to look into the aromatics of Muscadine, kind of really map them out. So we have a professional mapping of the aromatic compounds in Muscadine wine, so that later on we can add proper yeasts and make wines that will really blow everyone's minds, which they already do. But that'll really put us in the driver's seat very, very quickly. So that's going on right now. Okay, now with blending. You may want to consider, you know, how you want to blend your wines and do lots of different, you know, samples in the lab. And you can have your friends try them, or other people in the winery try them, or even the consumers if you want to pop a bottle out there and say, hey, how do you like this? Naturally, take excellent records as you're making your blends so you have repeatability and note what worked and what didn't work. And you don't have to get caught up in the weeds too much of like 0.24553 milliliters of Carlos mixed with 23.78, you know, it really, you can do pretty simple blends. Muscadine is a very aromatically hearty wine, so you don't need to get so wrapped up in tiny details when it comes to blending. I mean, that's up to you if you want to, absolutely. But again, repeatability, very important, so keep a record of your blends. Okay, so final filtration, here's some options for you. Most common in wineries of our size are going to be this plate and frame situation. And you see this metal plate in between, that means that you can do 2 filtration steps at the same time. So I can go from, you know, 1 micron to 0.45 microns, which is sterile, all in the same run. And that saves time and ultimately money in that sense. So some of the other options out there for your final filtration or filtration period are a cross flow filter, which is this unit here in the middle. And because there's no filter medium in a cross flow filter, you can just run your wine through there and stop and maybe clean out the filters and then run another batch through and just keep running it through until you're at a sterile point. Whereas these require filter pads that are very expensive. Crossflow does not need that, but the cost of purchasing a crossflow filter is very high. So you just have to see which is best for your needs. Overall, you would save money eventually with the crossflow filter, but it's a big upfront cost, sorry. And then there's this vertical DE filter, which, so this is what it looks like inside. When it's open, you have these plate and frames, or these frames here, and then you swim DE over these frames and the wine runs through them and is filtered that way with different grades of DE. Quite often these are used early on in production to remove rougher solids, but I think in the meantime they have a way to do sterile as well. Okay, yeah, so hey, we've reached the end, and I appreciate you for hanging out there with us today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have going forward. So let me check out the chat and see what questions we've got here. Okay, great. Thanks for putting up the website for Scott Labs and Carolina Wine Supply. Those are our local guys, so we try to support them as much as we can. So does anybody have any?
There's a question, is there a specific type of sugar that you recommend?
That's a good question. So we use a non-GMO regular grain sugar. And that's pretty common, just to use a regular form of sugar. You can purchase it, believe it or not, at Walmart, or you can purchase it at Costco or, excuse me, at Sam's in larger quantities. There's some wineries that use a, you know, they may go to not high fructose corn syrup, and there's debate about if that may affect the flavor. Generally, it does have like a kind of a very intense sweetness to it that does overshadow a lot of the aromatics. So, I mean, we definitely tend for the non-GMO sugar option.
Do people use corn syrup, or is corn syrup totally frowned on, or what's the story with corn syrup? It's cheap.
Corn syrup is cheap for large, huge quantities because you can get them like truckload if you're a majorly large winery. It's not that cheap necessarily for wineries, and I mean, maybe for home winemakers, but it is frowned upon when people realize that that's a source. It's also definitely going to have an effect on the flavor profile of your wine. So yeah, it is looked down upon, sure, certainly for health benefit wise as well. It's just easily accessible for those who may suffer from sugar issues. It's not a very good option.
I have a question here myself. Kevin Elder, who's on this, I'm trying to identify who you are. So if you would put in the chat your winery and your email, then I can figure out how you relate to our database. I'll send you a couple of texts, but if you're still on, Kevin, tell me who you are. And you can just do that as a message to me or an email later. I'm sure people have more questions for Nadia. That was incredibly interesting, particularly for somebody like me, not a winemaker, and for other winemakers as well. Daryl, and if there are no more questions, Daryl, maybe you'd like to tell the story you were telling at the beginning about the issue that you were dealing with that may be a problem for other winemakers as well.
Yeah, basically, what I was talking about was, basically we ran into an issue with zygo Saccharomyces. The issue with that is that for the most part, the other two yeast, Brett and Saccharo, we can sort of kind of mitigate that if it ends up in the bottle with sorbate levels and KMS levels. With Zygo, it doesn't care about that. You're not going to be able to put the amount that you would need to inhibit that yeast strain and it be safe for people to drink. And Zygo can live in 20% alcohol. So there's nothing you can do after the wine has been bottled or, in solution that's going to stop Zygo from acting on the sugar. So, that was something new to us, and it's something that's more common with people that deal with fruit wines more so than non-fruit wines. We do a lot of fruit wines, so it hit us, and we didn't know what to do, and how we ended up fixing that was we actually used a sanitizing agent called Maxisan. And what it is peracetic acid. So yeah, it was a major scare for us, but it's been sorted out, and now we have added some sanitation practices that we didn't have prior to.
So Daryl, do you mean you're like sanitizing your tanks and your bottling line with that, or like everything?
Yeah.
You just replace it as an alcohol?
Everything that comes in contact with our wine has been doused with peracetic acid.
Okay. And where do you source that?
And at a 10% solution, it's no rinse. If you get above 10% solution, then you have to rinse. But at a 10% solution with water, you don't have to rinse. We had that meeting last Monday at Shadow Springs. When I left there, I went by Carolina Wine Supply and got the Maxisan. They have it there in 5-gallon containers. So that's where I got it from. But again, if you can. And I guess with that, it has a better information about how to mix it and how to use it. Or you can just get peracetic acid straight, but I don't know how to dilute it, or so on and so forth. Where you can buy Maxisan as a trade name or brand name, and it gives you instructions on how to use it. But yeah, I mean, that's what got rid of it for us, and so now we're all of the surfaces for that come in contact with wine get sprayed down first with the peracetic acid solution. But after this, I'll send links to information about Zygo Saccharomyces. And how to control it, because peracetic acid has a 99.9% kill rate for Zygo. But there's a lot of information there, and some information about sanitation practices in the winery. I thought that I was doing things the way I needed to, but obviously that I wasn't, because peracetic acid is, Zygo is surface. So anything that comes in contact with that surface that's been infected with Zygo, then basically you're just passing it through the winery to different you filtered, or if you used your pump to move some wine to a different location, to another tank, and it had Zygo in it, and then you didn't run peracetic acid through that pump, and you took that pump to, say, you're, getting ready to bottle, and use that same pump to run through your sterile filter. Well, now you just contaminated everything with the Zygo. You just put it in your filter. Maybe you're, you don't get on the other side of your filter, but, because a 0.45 absolute should easily remove Zygo. But if it gets into your lines, then, it's there and it's just passing through again. So now it's downstream from your absolute filter. So yeah, I mean, it was a scary learning experience because, I was putting wine in the bottle that I knew within a month it's going to push the cork out. So that was not a happy feeling at all. But again, I'll post all the things that I learned, so anybody that comes in contact with this again, there's information out there that they can look at. But my thing is to take the sanitation measures to where you don't never have to worry about it. Not where you're scrambling to try to figure out how to get it out of your system. It's just never there. Because anybody that messes with the fruit wines, you may see it, but if you use any fruit concentrates, from what I understand, that's where you actually possibly could get Zygo introduced into your winery. And for us, I mean, I don't use concentrates. I don't know where it came from. I wished I did. It would make me feel a little bit better about what I'm doing. But now I know how to make it go away. So anyway, but yeah, I will share the information and the knowledge that I learned and the articles that I read to get me past it. So, but I think that it was definitely something that our industry and any winemakers in North Carolina need to know, because I spoke to a lot of people and they were telling me they had never heard of Zygo. So yeah, I mean, it's out there, it's prevalent, and you may actually have it and you don't know because you're not doing testing. I used the labs in California, because ETS labs, you could say, is the gold standard for wine testing in North America, because they handle the California wine industry. But we were able to work with them, run some scorpion tests to make sure we got rid of this thing. And right now it's showing that we're all less than 10 cells per 250 milliliters of solution. So, but yeah, I'll post this information so it's available.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
We've got another question here. What's the color extraction dwell time on the skins for red muscadines?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it kind of depends on the style of wine you're making. Generally, like if you want high extraction because you want to yield a lot of color for your blends, then you may want to go ahead and do the full red wine treatment that they do in Europe on their wines. So that could be up to 2 weeks on the skins, and with constant pump overs naturally, to yield a very, very deep, heavy color. However, if you're just kind of looking for that light red wine style, you can just let it kind of cold soak for a day or two and do punch downs, let it go through fermentation. And then as soon as fermentation is over, go ahead and press it off. And you should have pretty decent color extraction there as well. May not be as deep and hearty, but it will be, definitely optimal for a nice light red wine style without it looking anything like a rosé.
Another question, do you ever have problems with acidity?
That's a good question. It depends, either too high or too low. And in either case, there are things you can do, but those are things you want to do before you go into fermentation. So while you're still in the juice stage and you're doing your chaptalization, adding your sugar, that's a good time to either add some tartaric acid because you need more, or remove some tartaric acid by adding a little bit of calcium carbonate, and that'll drop your acid level maybe a notch or two. Other than that, generally, we haven't encountered any issues with acid. Muscadine tends to have a very nice hearty acid. And don't forget, you're back adding with sugar. If you are back sweetening, then you don't really need to worry about there being an excessive amount of acid, so to speak. If you're adding sugar later on, you get that sweet tart action going on. It kind of develops a richness, and having that acid can be beneficial, even if it is like, you know, maybe if it's beyond 9 grams per liter, you may be considering dropping it back a little bit. But anything below that, which it usually is, and it's usually somewhere above 5, you're in a good range. You should be pretty safe.
Any other questions? You can unmute yourself and just ask them, or again, you can type them in.
Yeah, Nadia. So do you guys not do any fermentation on the skins? So you don't do any cold soaking or anything? You go straight to press?
We do. We actually do. So we also have Noble, and we what we'll do is I'll cold soak it on the reefer truck at a very cold temperature, and then probably like overnight at the most, 24 hours, and then I'll pull it, and then we'll either ferment. Usually what we wind up doing is fermenting a portion in the bins by doing punch downs. We have a punch down draw. And then we also do a portion in a tank, and that we do a pump over on. And therefore we can kind of mediate between our color concentration later on. And we'll usually leave the ones that are in the bins on the skins for a while. The other ones we'll then, after fermentation, we'll go ahead to the press with the batch that we did in the tank. So we have 2 different variations there: a highly extracted version, if we want to do any kind of drier red setups or so forth, and then something that's a bit lighter and brighter for our blends that we do.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Because for the most part, I cold soak everything. And I guess that's the old style of doing things. That's the way I grew up seeing, watching Dad make wine, and so it's transferred over to the commercial side. So we will normally cold soak for almost 3 days before we actually move to press. But I'm sort of kind of leaning back to looking at doing an immediate crush and press. One, it saves space and vessels, because I don't know about well, I know you guys have a lot more space than I do, especially within your new facility. But bins with tons and tons of grapes in them takes up a lot of space.
Yes, it does. It does. But we do maybe 6 or so in the bins usually. So,
okay.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. But no, soaking like that is excellent. That'll get your color as well, and get lighter aromatics and lighter flavors later on, which is what we're kind of gearing with Muscadine anyway. So yeah, that's wonderful.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. Well, that sounds like the end of our questions. I want to thank Nadia for a wonderfully detailed and knowledgeable presentation. We will post the recording for this as well as her PowerPoint on our website. I've shared the link, but I'll also send it to all of you who participated in an email. We do have some sessions coming up in August oriented towards home gardeners and home winemakers. They're both are pairs of sessions on a Wednesday and a Saturday, and they're in the events section of our website. And I really want to encourage those of you who are wineries, folks who have customers for your farms or your winery, and to please share those with your friends, your customers, your neighbors, people who've been interested in what you do, how you grow your grapes, how you make wine, because they may want to be doing it themselves. And the more interest and excitement we have about muscadines among the general public, the better it is for all of us. So unless there are further comments, that concludes this webinar. And again, many thanks to Nadia.
Thank you all so much. It was enjoyable.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.